Okay, so get ready to dig into some pretty heavy history today.
Yeah.
We're taking a look at Lala Lajpat Rai's Unhappy India, which she wrote back in 1928. And it's basically a response, a whole book responding to Catherine Mayo's Mother India, right?
Right.
We don't have to get into all the nitty-gritty of that book, but safe to say it wasn't exactly a love letter to India, especially not from a Western perspective.
Well, and I think what's really interesting about Unhappy India is that Lajpat Rai, I mean, this is a major, major figure in India's fight for independence, really systematically kind of takes apart all the claims that are in Mother India, one by
Right.
one. He brings in history, he brings in the cultural context. I mean, some of his arguments are just so sharp and really eye-opening, even today.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, okay, you want to talk about India? Let's talk about India, but we're going to do it on my terms this time.
Hmm.
And he brings the receipts too.
He does.
So where does he even begin with all this?
Well, he starts with education,
Okay.
which is really interesting because, one of the big arguments in Mother India was that this British education system, this was helping India.
Right.
And Lajpat Rai just completely flips that on its head.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
So
He's like,
people are-
hold on a minute. India had this thriving, really well-established education system long before the British ever showed up. And he even points to people like Reverend Key and Dr. Leitner, who, they wrote a lot about these indigenous education systems, just to back up what he's saying.
Yeah, it's like he's saying we were doing just fine before you got here. But I'm guessing he doesn't stop there.
No, no, not at all. He actually goes on to argue that the British, they intentionally dismantled the education systems that were already in place in India and put in a new system that was designed to, well, create a certain type of Indian.
Okay, what do you mean by a certain type? Like what?
I mean, people who were more likely to just go along with British rule.
Oh, okay.
They wanted people who would fit in.
So he's basically saying they're using education as a tool of control. That's a pretty big accusation.
It is. But then he backs it up. He points out how much they emphasized English language instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And often, that came at the expense of traditional Indian forms of learning.
Right.
And this, he argued, this created a divide where if you were educated in the British system, you had more power, more influence, you became kind of the new elite.
And, he even throws out some pretty shocking literacy statistics. I mean, he claims that literacy was way more widespread in pre-British India, which is like the exact opposite of what you see in Mother India.
Right. And I think this really gets at that whole idea of the white man's burden, this idea that the West, they had to step in and civilize the East.
Right, right. Yeah.
And Lajpat Rai is basically like, I don't think so. We weren't the ones who needed civilizing.
It's so interesting how he's taking on like this huge idea, this justification for colonialism,
Yeah.
but he's doing it through something as specific as education policy.
Exactly. He's showing how these actions that might seem on the surface like, oh, we're here to help,
Yeah.
often had this whole other agenda behind them.
Mm. Now, Mother India also had a lot to say about the caste system in India, so I'm guessing Lajpat Rai addresses that as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He doesn't shy away from it at all. I mean, he acknowledges that the caste system, yeah, it's rigid, and yeah, it has its problems.
Sure.
But he says, look, the way it exists now, this isn't some ancient inherent thing. It's a product of medieval times that was made worse by British policies.
Okay, so he's adding that historical context.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, yeah, we're dealing with this, but it's more complicated than you're making it seem. And by the way, you haven't helped.
Right, right.
Like, for example, he brings up how the British exploited the untouchables, the people considered outside the caste system, as a way to further their own goals.
Oh, like a divide and conquer type of thing.
Exactly.
It's classic. Like create a problem or exploit an existing one, and then you swoop in and present yourself as the solution.
Exactly. And Lajpat Rai, he's calling them out on it. And he uses this very specific example, the Land Alienation Act. Have you heard of that?
I haven't, no.
So basically, it was this British policy that used caste labels to determine who could own land and who couldn't. And Lajpat Rai argues that this just made those divisions even worse. And of course, it benefited the British because it disrupted these traditional land ownership patterns.
Well, and that's always more powerful, isn't it? When you can point to actual policies and show how they played out in people's everyday lives. It's not just a theory anymore. It's real.
Exactly. And Lajpat Rai does that throughout the whole book. He takes these big abstract ideas and makes them real, with these concrete examples.
So we've got education, we've got the caste system. What else? What other parts of Indian society does he talk about?
Well, Mother India had a lot to say about the treatment of women in India.
Oh, I bet.
And this is another area where Lajpat Rai is just like, hold on a second, let's talk about hypocrisy.
Because it wasn't like women in the West were exactly, enjoying perfect equality at that time.
Exactly. And he's like, look, while the status of women in India may have declined over time, even during British rule, they still had certain rights and protections. And those are completely ignored by these Western critics.
So he's adding nuance, basically. Like, he's not denying that problems exist, but he's saying, let's not pretend this is a one-sided issue.
Precisely. And he makes this point brilliantly when he talks about child marriage.
Okay. Which was a big point of contention at the time, right?
Huge. And he says, okay, yes, it's a concern. But then he turns it around. He's like, but hold up. At the same time this is happening, women in the West are just starting to fight for basic rights, like the right to vote.
Right.
He even brings up specific examples of how slow the progress of women's rights was in Western countries. And get this, he takes these examples straight from Mother India.
Oh, that's good. He's using their own words against them.
Oh, yeah. He's like, I'll call out our problems when you acknowledge yours.
Classic case of the pot calling the kettle black. But, it's one thing to point out hypocrisy. It's another thing to back it up. Does he do that?
Oh, absolutely. Lajpat Rai was so thorough in his research. I mean, he's citing all kinds of sources, historical accounts, government reports, you name it. But he doesn't just like throw these sources at you and expect you to be impressed, He weaves them into his arguments in this really smart way that's actually very engaging to read.
So it's not just a rant, it's a carefully constructed argument.
Exactly. He's not just trying to win an argument.
Yeah.
He's trying to change how people see the world.
Which is a lot harder, honestly.
Oh, for sure.
And a lot more important. It really makes you realize, how important it is to get, like, the whole story, to hear from different perspectives, especially with something like history.
Oh, absolutely.
But, okay, let's talk about economics for a second, because, like, the British Empire, I mean, their whole thing was that they were bringing progress to these places they were colonizing, right?
Right.
So I'm guessing Lajpat Rai had something to say about that.
Oh, yeah, he definitely did.
Yeah.
Because, you see, Mother India, it kind of paints this picture of India as this poor, impoverished nation that desperately needed the British to come in and save it.
Okay.
And Lajpat Rai is like, nope, not even close. He argues that before British rule, India was actually incredibly wealthy.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Like he talks about these flourishing industries and these bustling cities and just like a really high standard of living.
So he's basically saying, we were doing just fine before you showed up. But, like, what evidence does he have? Because that's a pretty bold claim.
Well, he pulls from a bunch of sources. Like he looks at historical accounts from travelers and economic data and even stuff that British officials themselves wrote.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Like, he quotes Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who, wrote a ton about India's economy before the British got there. So he's basically using their own words to dismantle this myth that India was this, like, backwards and poor nation before they arrived.
That's such a good strategy, though. Like, use their own sources against them.
Right.
So, okay, if India was so prosperous, then what happened?
Well, according to Lajpat Rai, that's where those British policies come in. He argues that British rule, particularly their economic policies, they systematically drained India of its wealth. He actually calls it the drain, and he uses all sorts of examples and hard figures to back it up.
Okay, so, like, what kind of policies are we talking about here? Give me some specifics. What was this drain?
So basically, he says that the British turned India into, like, this giant supplier of raw materials for their own industries in Britain.
Okay.
But they would take those materials from India at really, really low prices. Then they'd ship everything to England, manufacture it into finished goods, and then, get this, sell those finished goods back to India at way higher prices.
Oh, wow. So they controlled the whole system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every step of the way, they were profiting. And meanwhile, it was preventing India from developing its own industries.
Yeah, it's like that saying, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. But in this case, it's more like, don't even think about fishing. We'll give you just enough to survive, and you'll always depend on us.
That's a perfect way to put it. And that's exactly what Lajpat Rai saw happening. He said these policies, they were devastating for India. They forced all these skilled artisans out of work, pushed tons of people into poverty, and it just created this awful cycle of dependency.
So he's drawing these connections between the economics and the social problems that were happening too. Man, it's just crazy how different a picture this is from what you see in Mother India.
I know, right? It really
Hmm.
makes you think. And he doesn't stop there either. I mean, we talked about economics, but he also goes after this idea that the British were there to bring, like, order and stability to India.
Yeah, because his argument is that they actually benefited from creating chaos and division, which,
Exactly.
I mean, okay, he talked about that with the caste system, but now he's talking about Hindu-Muslim relations, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He says the British, they intentionally made things worse between Hindus and Muslims on purpose just to maintain control.
It's classic divide and rule, isn't it?
Oh, totally. He says they would, like, favor one group over the other, pit them against each other, and then point to those very conflicts like, see, we need to be here. You can't even get along with each other.
Oh, that's so manipulative. Like, create a problem and then act like you're the only solution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Lajpat Rai saw right through it. He calls out that hypocrisy and, of course, backs it up with history, too.
Of course.
He gives all these examples of actual British officials saying they should use this divide and rule strategy.
Wow. So it wasn't even a secret?
Nope. It was a deliberate strategy. He even talks about how the British would use religious differences to justify their presence in India. They'd be like, oh, we're just here to keep the peace between these warring factions.
As if they weren't the ones making it worse in the first place.
Right. And that's what makes his critique so powerful. He isn't just saying, like, oh, you were wrong about this one thing. He's exposing this whole pattern of manipulation.
Yeah. And it's not just individual things anymore. It's the education system and the caste system and the economy and the strategy of divide and rule. He's basically saying this wasn't just a few bad decisions. The whole system was messed up.
Exactly. And it's not even just about the system itself, but how it impacted, like, the psychology of the Indian people, too. He talks about this sense of inferiority that colonialism created, this idea that Indians weren't capable of ruling themselves, that they needed the British to guide them.
It's that whole white savior complex, right?
Yep. Yes. Like they were somehow more advanced, more civilized. And Lajpat Rai just dismantles that whole idea. He calls this feeling, this belief that they needed the British, the slave mentality. And he says it's one of the biggest things holding India back.
So, like, how do you even begin to undo that? How do you come back from generations of that kind of thinking?
Well, Lajpat Rai really believed that education was a big part of it.
Okay.
But not just any education, not the kind the British were pushing. He wanted an education system that celebrated Indian culture and values, something that taught people how to think for themselves and question everything they'd been told.
So it's about more than just learning facts. It's about unlearning all the lies, too.
Exactly. And he knew it wouldn't be easy. It
Yeah.
takes time, it takes work. But he said it was crucial for India's future.
It's like, how do you even begin to, like, decolonize your own mind after all that? You know?
It's a process for sure.
Makes you wonder, though, with all the, like, criticizing he's doing of the British Empire, Lajpat Rai, did he have any, like, hope for the future, or was it all just, like, doom and gloom?
Oh, no, he definitely had hope. I mean, he wouldn't have fought so hard if he didn't believe things could change.
That's true. So what was his vision for the future of India then?
Well, he really believed in this idea of Hindu-Muslim unity. He knew the British had used that whole divide and rule thing to drive a wedge between those communities, but he felt like India's future depended on them coming together.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Like, even today, that's still a challenge, right? So for him to be talking about this back then, it's pretty far-sighted. But, I mean, how did he think they could actually achieve that when there's so much, tension and distrust?
Well, he kept going back to this idea that, like, at their core, Hindus and Muslims in India, they share so much, a common history, culture, even a destiny.
Okay.
So, practically speaking, he was all about interfaith dialogues, having Hindus and Muslims actually talk to each other,
Yeah.
integrated schools so kids are growing up together, cooperating on, like, social and economic stuff. He saw those as the building blocks for a shared national identity.
It's about focusing on what unites you, not what divides you, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as much as he criticized the British Empire, he knew that independence by itself wasn't enough, that India needed, like, a whole new way of thinking, a way to break free from that slave mentality that we were talking about.
So he wanted them to be the ones in control of their own future.
Yes, to see themselves as capable and worthy of shaping their own destiny. And of course, education was a huge part of that.
Not that British education system, though.
Definitely not. He wanted something rooted in Indian culture and values, something that encouraged critical thinking and challenged all those assumptions that were left over from colonialism.
So it's not just about changing the curriculum, it's about, like, changing the whole way you see yourself and your place in the world.
100%. And for him, this wasn't just some theory, this was his life. Lajpat Rai, I mean, he lived and breathed these ideals. He was out there fighting for independence, writing, giving speeches, inspiring people. He even went to jail for his beliefs.
Yeah.
Multiple times.
Wow. Talk about dedication.
Right. But sadly, all that activism, it took a toll on him.
Because didn't he die during a protest?
Yeah, in 1928, he was leading this huge demonstration against the Simon Commission.
Which was?
Oh, it was this British commission. They sent them over to, review the political situation in India. The problem was there weren't any Indians on the commission.
Oh, wow. Talk about adding insult to injury.
Right. So anyway, Lajpat Rai is leading this protest, and the police, they cracked down hard, really brutally. And Lajpat Rai, he was badly injured.
That's awful.
Yeah. And he died a few weeks later from those injuries.
So he literally became a martyr for Indian independence.
He did. And his death, it sparked outrage all over India. It just fueled the movement even more.
It's tragic, though, that it takes something like that to make people pay attention.
It is. But Lajpat Rai, even though he's gone, he left this incredible legacy behind. His writing, his speeches, that unwavering belief in India, it still resonates so strongly today. Unhappy India, it's a reminder that we have to challenge the stories we're told, that our voices matter.
It's a call to action, isn't it, for anyone who feels like they're not being heard?
Absolutely. And it shows how important it is to think for ourselves, to question the narratives that have been forced on us.
To, decolonize our own minds.
Yes.
Wow. Well, that was incredible. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into unhappy India. Lajpat Rai's story, it's a powerful reminder that change is possible, even if it's hard, even if it takes time, and that our voices, our stories, they have the power to make a difference.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, keep listening, and keep diving deep.